Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the role of cities in climate resilient development. My name is Heidi Bade and I will be the moderator for today's session and introduce the great panel that we have with us today. Thank you to all panelists and guests who are joining us to learn more about the role of cities in low carbon climate resilient development. Please feel free to ask questions to the panelists in the chat. We'll have time for that at the end. The session will be recorded for your information. First out today, we will have Lars Andreas Lunde on behalf of Norad, Erik Berg on behalf of Habitat Norge to say a few welcoming words on behalf of the two co-hosting institutions. And then we will have two speakers from IPCC. First, Mark Pelling, professor at King's College London. He is one of the lead authors on IPCC's report on the climate change impact and adaptation, and will share some of the key insights. After him, we will turn to Sheela Patel, a principal researcher at the Global Center on Adaptation. He was also lead author of the urban chapter of the IPCC report launched yesterday, which you may be familiar with. Norad supports the Global Center on Adaptation's Africa program, where nature-based solutions in cities is one of the key areas. But he is here more as a scientist to tell us about the climate mitigation in cities, and in particular cities in countries relevant to Norwegian development assistance. But first out, let me give the floor to Lars Andreas Lunde.
Good morning and welcome to everyone to this webinar organized by Norad and Habitat Norge on the role of cities in climate resilient development. My name is Lars Andreas Lunde and I'm head of the section for nature and climate here in Norad. Globally, two of the most important trends we see these days are, for the first, climate change, and the second, the strong urbanization going on in many parts of the world, especially in these developed countries. Urban areas are now home to 4.2 billion people. This means that the majority of the world's population today live in cities. And between 2015 and 2020, urban population grew by almost 400 million people. More than 90% of this growth took place in less developed regions. Urbanization has many consequences, but it also has consequences for climate policies, both when it comes to mitigation and when it comes to adaptation. Yesterday, the Working Group 3 of the 6th assessment report from IPCC was published, focusing on how we can mitigate climate change in various sectors. Although the message was serious, underlying the urgency of acting now if we are to combat climate change, it also shows that it is possible still to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement, if we act now. And much of this action will take place in urban areas. Climate change is man-made, and when most of mankind are living in urban areas, it's also where very much of the important action for combating climate change has to take place. It is crucial to make growth going on in cities sustainable in line with low carbon development, because without climate action in cities, we don't stand a chance to reach the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Therefore, we have to find ways that the rapid and ongoing urbanization, especially in Africa and Asia, can happen in entirely new ways. We need to move away from the carbon-intensive model of low carbon and move to low carbon resilient cities. And we hope that today's panelists will shine some light to do that. Urbanization also affects climate adaptation. Urbanization processes generate vulnerability and exposure, which combined with climate change hazards to drive urban risks and impacts. Most cities are located in coastal areas and many along rivers and waterways. This makes cities especially vulnerable to rising sea levels, river floods and hurricanes. The capacity for climate resilience is low, especially in informal settlements. Urbanization therefore increases the need for adaptation and climate resilience, something I also expect to learn more about today. So I'm really looking forward to this webinar. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Erik Berg, and as chair of Habitat Norge, an advocacy and information association promoting urban sustainable development in the global perspective, it is an honor and a pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar based on IPCC part report 3, focusing on solutions. We are particularly encouraged to have speakers from 2 IPCC working groups with us, as well as representatives from local authorities and urban civil society movements. Given the urban neglect of the 6-decade-long development era, I would like to congratulate Norad with its development towards 2030 planning initiative. In particular, the report Development Assistance Contribution to Reduce Climate Gas Emissions, Solutions for Humans, Climate and Nature. According to former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, the decisive struggle for sustainable development takes place in cities. Here, the crisis of finance, food, fuel, floods, fight, fever, flight, fear, and fury all meet. They not only have in common that they start with an F. These challenges all convene in urban regions where accordingly most of the solutions need to be found and implemented. Today's context is that these multiple crises, they interact simultaneously and universally all over the planet. They thus need to be fought simultaneously with climate-robust approaches. The metaphor of a butterfly striking its wings in the northwestern Arctic region, creating a storm also in the global south, has never been more relevant and actual. We all are in the same boat, and hopefully it's a wooden one. Despite this, neither city authorities nor civil society organizations representing the vulnerable, estimated at 3.5 billion, are really given a seat at the table in climate negotiations, in action planning processes, or in implementation on the ground. These are the stakeholders where most of traditional experience and knowledge is found on how ecosystems could meet future challenges. Coming together in grassroots movements like Wairu Commission on Gender, Slumdwellers International, Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, and organizations for street vendors, waste pickers, and home workers. All partners of Habitat Norge. As underscored in the Norad report, there is strong need to integrate poverty reduction and climate mitigation adaptation in urban development programs to promote climate-robust development. To address this nexus, 8 principles for locally led adaptation were adopted in 2021. But the question still remains, what does locally led adaptation really mean? To answer this question, we are honored to have with us Sheela Patel from Slumdwellers International, as well as retired Chief Planner of Oslo, Elllen de Vibe, now lead activist in Habitat Norge. Cities, according to Shlomo Angel, professor of city planning at New York University, represent hope because of their infinite complexity. Millions of people making billions of unrelated decisions on their own, day in and day out, and it all comes together somehow. Cities work because of their innate resilience. They have an inexhaustible ability to reinvent themselves, to regenerate their civic spirit, to fashion and to refashion innovative solutions to crisis, and even to rise from the ashes. The city no longer stops at its borders, and neither does this webinar. Thank you for your attention. I'm now pleased to pass on the floor to Mark Pelling, lead author of IPCC Work Group 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me share my screen whilst I'm doing that. First of all, to express my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to talk at the event. And here we are. What I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes is to highlight a number of the key themes and messages that come from Working Group 2. So that's the report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. You can see on this side some of the key points that I'm going to talk to, and then highlighted in blue the documents that I've drawn the evidence from to make this presentation. So there are a number of key documents, the summary for policymakers and technical summary that you may be familiar with, but also a human settlements fact sheet, and of course, Chapter 6 in Working Group 2, which is dedicated to cities, settlements, and key infrastructure. I've also noted on this introductory slide some of the statistics, if you will, of the report, just to remind us of the scale of the exercise, and also some of its constraints in terms of geographical coverage and diversity. So if I start off, the first point to make, and very strongly from Working Group 2 in this 6th assessment report, is that the observed impacts of climate change are widespread and pervasive. In cities and urban areas, the risk faced by people and assets from hazards associated with climate change has increased. And this is a much stronger statement than in AR5, where impacts are identified in health systems, infrastructure, and agriculture, but in a much lower level of concentration. That was in part to do with a much stronger system of observation and a much more comprehensive research base now than in the past, but also tracks climate change and arguably increasing vulnerability. So we also see that evidence from urban and rural settlements is unequivocal. Climate impacts are felt disproportionately in urban communities, with the most economically and socially marginalized most affected. Climate change then is deeply interconnected with questions of marginalization. To resolve climate change risk is to confront underdevelopment, maldevelopment, and inequality. Globally, urban populations have grown by more than 397 million people between 2015 and 2020, as was mentioned in the introduction to this session. More than 90% of this growth is occurring in less developed regions, with the most rapid growth in urban vulnerability in unplanned and informal settlements and in smaller to medium urban centers in low and middle income nations where capacity is limited. So there is this culmination of rapid growth, low capacity, and exposure to risk that can very much help us to focus our interventions. That said, global urbanization offers a time-limited opportunity to work towards widespread and transformational adaptation and climate resilient development. Essentially, the next 10 to 15 years is felt to be a period of rapid urban growth, people moving to and growing in cities, infrastructure then being built to varying levels and standards. And it's this growth, this opportunity to build new infrastructure, to build the planning systems that deliver that infrastructure that provides us with a unique opportunity to build risk reduction, to build adaptation, mitigation, and social justice into the urban fabric, the physical and the social fabric. Just a couple of words on impacts. I won't read all of these points, but it just supports that sense that the observed impacts are widespread and pervasive. Urbanization, of course, compounds climate risk through the urban heat island, through interactions of temperature with air pollution, through concretization and lack of maintenance of drainage, through deforestation of watersheds and hill slopes. All of these very manageable systems are deeply connected with the way in which climate change hazards are felt in cities. Hopefully you've had a chance to read some of these points, but for the first time in the AR6, we're able to show and report from the literature the ways in which heat stress, for example, reduces labor capacity, that the infrastructure damages that have been observed and to be expected are of a serious nature in all countries and globally. For physical infrastructure with a value of 143 US trillion, we expect losses of 4.2 trillion US dollars by the end of this century. Huge amounts of money at stake. But let's not forget the focus. 1/3 of African cities with populations over 300,000 are located in areas at high risk of climate hazards. And coastal cities, especially in South and Southeast Asia, are expected to see significant increase in average annual economic losses between 2.5 and 250, with very high losses in East Asian cities under high emission scenarios. Another novel part of the literature that we were able to report in AR6 is the multiple ways in which climate hazards are felt. So not only directly through rainfall leading to flooding or temperature leading to heat or cold shocks, but through cascades of hazard and risk. For example, if an event knocks out an energy supply system, that will have consequences for the provision of urban services, for maintaining information technology and transport across the city. And failure in any of those services will have knock-on consequences for the delivery of social infrastructure, education, healthcare, policing, and so forth. So cities then become nodes in risk cascades. Risks cascade out from cities, they cascade across cities through interconnected infrastructure network. But risk also concentrates where the direct and cascading impacts meet. And they concentrate where there is inadequate housing, where there are people who experience underlying health conditions with fragile livelihoods and who are marginalized from political decision-making. COVID was an example of that process. We've also been able to demonstrate that there is an urban adaptation gap. So this is the gap today between the risk experienced and the ability of cities to manage that risk. And that gap is largest for the poorest populations of all cities in all regions. And that gap is not closed, even if we deploy all planned adaptation and all currently possible adaptation. So there is inequality built into the system and an adaptation gap that needs to be resolved before we even talk about adapting to future risk. And indeed, resolving that gap is perhaps the best way of advancing adaptation. We do have excellent plans in many cities or nations for urban adaptation. Many of those plans, though, are not enacted. So along with the adaptation gap is a policy action gap, which the literature allows us to define to some extent in AR6. So many adaptation options exist. Financing exists, but is limited and focused inappropriately or incompletely, and knowledge exists, but is often also held unequally and not deployed in a consistent and inclusive way. This is the last figure I want to show, which tries to map different adaptation options against climate resilient development, which we understand as development that enables adaptation, mitigation, social justice, and contains risk spread. You can see this table in chapter 6, but just to highlight some key messages, we find that urban planning is the single most impactful activity across this range of climate resilient development variables. We find that social policy and ecosystem-based adaptation can resolve many of the social and ecological constraints of physical infrastructure. But we find that no adaptation is good at preventing the transfer of risk from to different people and places. So that climate resilient development is most likely to come from a hybrid of physical, nature-based or ecosystem-based solutions and social policy. To conclude then, from AR6, we find for cities that observed impacts for the first time are widespread, pervasive, and unequal. That urbanization processes intervene in producing and reducing risk. That we know a lot of how to reduce risk and inequality in that adaptation process, but this is not being put into practice. And that the next 10 to 15 years of rapid urbanization, especially in Africa and Asia, is a time-limited opportunity to build adaptation, mitigation, and equity into urban infrastructure, economies, and decision-making. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to the chairs or to Shway Boassa from Working Group 3. Thank you.
Shway Boassa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, chairs. Good morning to everyone. And I'm happy to be here, very pleased to have been invited to present key findings from Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change. Was coordinating lead author for Chapter 8 on urban systems and other human settlements. I don't have a presentation, but I have notes that I'm referring to, which I'll share with a little bit of editing afterwards to provide with some key iconic figures as well, so that they can be shared across the participants. Just to follow up on what Mark has presented in terms of the complexity of the process, many authors and the statistics of the involvement of women in our chapter. We had 4 women out of 13 authors, but then the number increased with the contributing authors, just as a highlight of the importance of inclusivity in the production of this assessment report on Chapter 8 on urban systems. To go to the key highlights of the Chapter 6, we just have to remind now that the report was released yesterday. Perhaps the information is still fresh to most of us who listened in and attended. Just want to recap that globally the anthropogenic GHG emissions increased between 2010 and 2019 by 12%, and that is over 54% since 1990. And of these, the urban share of global emissions is between 67 and 72 for the estimate of 2020. What does this imply? That cities are still contributing a large share of emissions globally, and cities are likely to continue to do that since they're growing. Over 58% of the global population is living in urban areas, and this is with high confidence. That has a lot of implications on what can be done in cities in order to transform the way that cities are built and systems are integrated to move to low carbon development within cities. It also has implications for emerging cities, particularly in regions like Africa and South Asia and Latin America, where the population is still urbanizing compared to other regions. And that is what my focus is going to be a little bit on, the key highlights of the implications of that. So there are 3 main transition and transformative initiatives in the mitigation field, which, as I'll later mention, is not only about mitigation, but also the adaptation and mitigation integration, is that we have to start thinking about reducing and changing energy and material consumption. We also have to do deep electrification of urban systems and cities. And it was good that one of the chair mentioned that cities operate and function beyond their own jurisdictional boundaries. We also have to, as a third important key highlight, with very high confidence, we have to enhance the carbon uptake and storage in the urban environments in order to achieve net zero emissions. And this means we have, as city systems, to work across the jurisdictional boundaries and influence supply chains so that the exported embedded emissions and imported embedded emissions are reduced across city systems. So the implication for rapidly growing and emerging cities, like in the case of Africa, is that there has to be very aggressive emission avoidance and emission reduction activities, but I want to underline with consideration of social justice. And that, from our findings, will be very much related to the development of low carbon and GHG emissions technologies, some of which are near to commercial level. Some of them are still under development, like batteries, electrification, solar power, and retrofitting of buildings, repurposing and targeting of mobility with non-motorized transport. All this is very much context-based, but there is a very high confidence that the reduction would be really deep and aggressive if the cities that are emerging can avoid these emissions associated with the current consumption levels within urban areas. And for the rapidly growing cities, the issue of repurposing and co-locating jobs and industrial manufacturing and civic areas together with housing is also very important to achieve compact urban form, whereas there could also be, in the case of cities in the developing countries, possibilities with high confidence of leapfrogging and transitioning through hybrid infrastructure that may not necessarily be centralized and networked, taking advantage of the technologies that are developing. Just like Mark mentioned, this means that planning is very important. Urban planning is very important. But whereas that is the case in developing countries where there is a mismatch between the capacities to plan and the resources available to plan, as well as the response on the ground and the rapid development, there has to be a combination of other approaches that are very much in the line of opportunities creation through the infrastructure for emerging cities, hybrid infrastructure, heterogeneous infrastructure that can allow creating economic opportunities that are of low carbon in nature. So there are again three highly important key highlights in this direction, where we can talk about in the cities enhancing carbon uptake through nature-based solutions, and specifically bio-based building materials, permeable surfaces, green roofs, urban forest and green spaces, blue spaces for uptake of carbon is going to be very important in emerging cities, those that are developing and emerging, and those that are yet to be developed. Now, with the urban planning and the technologies talked about, if the high quality of life is going to be attained, as I underlined earlier, then social justice and sustainable development have to be very much considered in the process of transitioning to low carbon urban development within the developing countries. And a good number of cities, including cities from developing countries, are also setting climate targets for net zero GHG emissions. And this will mean that effectiveness of the strategies will depend on the cooperation and coordination between national and subnational governments, as well as city jurisdictions, industry, private sector, and civil society, where adequate and the capacity to plan and implement mitigation strategies exist. Where these capacities are limited, they have to be enhanced. And this key finding is with a high confidence that cooperation and coordination of all actors is with high confidence most likely going to spur a deep decarbonization and transition from to avoid emissions with emerging cities and rapidly growing cities. Then this has implications on density, land use mix, connectivity, accessibility, mobility modes, as mentioned earlier, for example, non-motorized transportation, all of which have to be implemented concurrently. And this is another key highlight of our findings in the chapter, is that most of the mitigation strategies in cities have to be concurrent. Our assessment of literature indicates that a good number of cities still manage carbon and working on reducing emissions based on sectors, but the reinforcements and the synergies between concurrent implementation of mitigation strategies across all sectors, energy consumption, transportation and mobility, sewage and sanitation, housing and building materials, is going to be very important to coordinate combined efforts to reduce emissions within the cities, and that can contribute to job creation, green growth, and low carbon development. This is with high confidence, and it is noted again in chapter 8 that the opportunities that lie with concurrent implementation of mitigation strategies can also accelerate equitable climate action because it brings multiple actors. It's not a given, but the literature says that there are opportunities for that, to bring multiple actors, civil society organization, communities to work together and achieve net zero emissions, but also deliver sustainable development and also build resilience. We know from our chapter findings that there are multiple core benefits of mitigation that can build resilience in terms of reducing the urban heat island effect, reducing air pollution in cities through nature-based solutions and the uptake of emissions within the cities, and in terms of well-being and health, but also job creation. All those core benefits can have an implication or bearing on resilient cities, but more markedly, also our findings indicate that climate risk, climate-induced risk like flooding, heat waves can also be reduced with some of these mitigation strategies like the nature-based solutions. As I end this short intervention, I just want to highlight that the overarching key finding in terms of delivering mitigation strategies concurrently in emerging cities will very much depend on climate governance at city level and beyond the city jurisdiction boundaries, integrating all sectors and policy domains, again, with high confidence, but this is something that will realize synergies and minimize trade-offs and connect national as well as subnational policy making levels. So think of a city with its boundary, it has to deal with what happens as a spillover from the city beyond its boundary, but also what comes in from within beyond its boundary. And together with the jurisdictions around that city, they can coordinate and deliver mitigation strategies, but which also have implications on resilience building. And two last points. One is about financial flows. Our findings indicate that there is a fall short in levels of financial flows needed, and there is a gap in order to bring the NDCs to be consistent with the target of limiting global warming under 2 degrees with limited offshoots from the findings yesterday. But this can be achieved through closing the financial flows, and that means scaling up financial flows for mitigation, and I would say as well as adaptation, but with very clear policies and signals from governments and international community. And with that, I would like to turn back to the chairs. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Good. Morning, everybody. We are running a bit short of time, I gather. My name is Ellен de Vibe. We will now move from theory into practice. Thank you for the invitation to participate. As the IPCC states, cities are important for reaching developmental resilience. Here is my granddaughter, Marley. I always ask myself, what type of world does she want to grow up in? I will talk briefly about climate budgeting, transport, nature-based systems, and urban spaces. First of all, climate budgeting. Oslo started climate budgeting 6 years ago as an integral part of the financial budgeting process. And this method, of course, is very much about backstaging, as the backcasting, as opposed to forecasting. We must decide what to do today to reach the Paris goals in the future. In the middle, you can see this backcasting for Oslo, which is also handling different types of risks and risks. The climate budget is based on our climate strategy related to emission, biodiversity, energy, resilience, indirect climate gases, and so on. You can read this later. The budget is developed on the baseline analysis for emissions related to the different sectors seen to the right. And on that basis, the budget has a resource allocation and an auditing system. And to handle this reliably, we use a climate barometer with indicators, which again then is implemented through different types of codes. Here, the example of documentation criteria for zoning plans. The C40 mayoral network focuses on the Paris goals, and through the climate budget piloting program they have, this is headed by Oslo. I would just like to show you Mumbai's climate plan. It is India's first science-based targeted climate plan, very thorough and impressive, I would like to say. It's both regional in its dimensions and city-focused, of course, and all stakeholders have been involved. And Mumbai has, through a baseline analysis in the same manner as Oslo, explored 6 focus areas. One of the 3 scenarios to the right here are being used. So you sort of work your way downwards through from vision to implementation. Each of the 6 focus areas have their own overarching goals with target goals and incremental implementation criteria for the deadlines of 2030, 2040, and 2050. And the chosen scenario, in this case ambitious, informs sector-wise targets and actions. And for instance, I've written here examples on transport and waste management. The next topic is about transport. Oslo started, just a minute. Oslo started its electrification of the transport system 20 years ago. We have had reduced national taxes on buying electric cars, strict parking codes. We support economically EV infrastructure in different ways. And previously, the electric cars had toll road and parking free access. Now there is a fee, but still less than for fossil vehicles. And by 2028, the public transport strategies will be emission-free, including for ferries. We may even reach this goal earlier than we expected. Our experience, as we call ourselves the EV capital of Europe, is that combining economic incentives and legal codes does work quite well. In 2020 figures, 63 of all new cars are being bought are electric, and I think now it's about 80%. And maritime transport, which is more demanding, is also being handled, for instance, to the right, by demanding foreign ferries to connect to electric shore energy supply. And this does increase innovation in the market. Construction industry has about 1/5 of all our emissions, and using the city's procurement power nudges the innovation process in the market. It's difficult to find adequate criteria for monitoring this field, but it's important to have test and trial and experiences on different methods of measuring. And now the city of Oslo demands fossil-free vehicles in all construction tenders, and we are quickly moving towards zero emission requirements. Then let me talk about NBS for a minute. It is not only about ordinary technical technology, but it's also about reinventing nature-given principles. The IUCN illustrates how nature is not an enemy, but a friend with its own values. Nature purifies air, soil, and water supply. It reduces noise and energy cost and builds resilience to climate change, and one would say, make people more happy. Nature may also be good business. It reduces maintenance and climate risks, and it creates green jobs. Acting with nature is much better than struggling against it. Here an example from Oslo Grorud Park, where phytoremediation or plant purification has been used, where plants within 2 to 3 years draws toxins from contaminated ground. And to the right, the application of green principles into a green-blue code for zoning plans to handle floods, biodiversity, and climate adaptation. An important learning point is that climate-friendly action often have multiple benefits. This example from Uganda, where you have dangerous kitchen cooking, often giving severe health hazards and fire risk, and forest is being destroyed. Here you see women turning biodegradable waste into burning briquettes, which stops deforestation, recycles waste, and gives poor people an income. I think it's an excellent example of applying theory, practice to theory. My last point is about urban spaces. From 2016 to 19, Oslo had a car-free livability program. Our main objective was to restructure the city floor from car domination to livability promoting arena. We prepared new zoning plan for what we call market streets, where half of the street should be used for pedestrians or greenery. And our overarching principle was that all spaces should be shared between different functions, and that every invention should provide added value with more than one function than the prime function. And here exemplified in the middle with a lighting construction, street furniture, which in the daytime was the play structure for children. 130 countries have gender-based rules that limit women's movement. But who are the most vulnerable ones? Is it the women, or could it be other groups? Oslo research shows that unattractive spaces for women are often used by more vulnerable groups like the homeless and drug addicts. And I think that feminists, or for that matter, call it good planning, should provide livability for all these groups. I would just show you an example from Zanzibar. We realized that many public spaces are unsafe and controlled by men or resourceful people. Here at Harumsi Square in Old Stone Town in Zanzibar is an example. And often crime prevention through environmental design gives gated communities, which is not what we want. Eva Storison's master thesis at the School of Architecture in Oslo explores how this square may be made more welcoming to women. Through cooperation with women's groups, she designed a pavilion with different layers of shielding and contact with the outside world, so that women themselves could decide how openly they wanted to appear. I would also like to point out that indoor commons, city sitting rooms you could call them, are also important, and they are safe spaces. Local youth library to the left, in a deprived area of Oslo, has an age limit of 16 years of age. You can't be older than 15. You can't have any parents there, and the young people have to take off their shoes to sort of make a softer environment. And to the right, the new public library in Oslo, Deichman, which in many ways is a free space for everybody, perhaps especially suitable for immigrant women. So our conclusion must be, it's important that IPCC conveys that cities are important, and it must affect our urban global development policies. All sectors and stakeholders must be involved, and systematically so. And there are ample of lessons of low-tech co-creation also from the global south that we should learn from. Thank you very much. Oh yes, I'm sorry, I should now introduce Sheila Patel. It's a pleasure for us to have you here. She is important in the Slumdwellers International organization, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us, Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask my presentation to be put up, please? I had sent it so that there shouldn't be a problem with this. So let me start off while the presentation is being uploaded. My name is Sheela Patel. I'm a grassroots activist who continues to work with slum dwellers in India through a federation called the National Slum Dwellers Federation and Mahila Milan, which is a women's network. And together we work in 9 states and 60 cities in India. And we are the founding members that created Shack Dwellers International, which today has 33 countries and over 250 cities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We have a very old and well-respected partnership with Norway and its development processes. I was first invited to Norway by Helge, who's sitting here today, to be part of the discussions of the people who chart cities. And since then, we have been assisted to become members of Cities Alliance, to work with Norwegian stakeholders in the GLTN process, and subsequently participated in many different projects that have to do with energy, to which Norwegian assistance supported us from looking at our development work from the point of view of energy and climate change. Can you move to the second slide, please? Heidi, can you move to the second slide? I'll just continue because I don't want to delay this. What you will find is that cities and informality have become very, very critical. The next slide, please. What we find is that informality in cities is much discussed in theory, but there is very little acknowledgement of the reality. And the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, which is STI's partner, actually brought this data together, which demonstrated that only 1.6% of housing stock and infrastructure possibly is provided by the market, and 95.7% of housing and infrastructure, whatever it is at survival levels, is produced by communities themselves. And therefore, it's important to create a space and a seat at the table for the urban poor and their leadership to participate in the transition, the transformation, and the fulfillment of our commitment for social justice, because they are the major actors in cities where 30 to 70% of the population in the global south today live informally in settlements. Next slide, please. What we have learned is that development and climate come together in poor people's lives. And therefore, as Dwellers International, which is this global organization with 33 country members, we seek to demonstrate that development investment seen with a climate lens is really the way forward, and not to see the SDGs and the climate compact as two different things, because they all come together in people, in cities, in all geographies. And now we're talking about 2 billion people whose life will be stuck here in this kind of informality with huge vulnerability and very little investment happening there. Next. In STI, which is now almost 3 decades old, we operate at leadership development through which we reach out to these 200 to 300 cities at 5 levels. We produce city level community leadership of men and women, which operate at localities, federating communities. Then the city level federations network together at the national level to make representation there and to bring national policies to communities. We have 5 hubs in STI. In Asia and Africa, there is 1 each, and 3 in Africa. Then at the STI level, and then some of us operate at the global level. But the idea is that knowledge, ideas, strategies, campaigns move up and down this pyramid with a view that we engage leadership of politicians, of bureaucrats, of scientists at each of these levels to address in a relationship of partnership solutions in which women are at the center of the process. The important thing here for us is that if you give choices to women, they operate with a legacy long after the initial intervention period goes on. And therefore, we champion women's role, although we don't exclude women, children, youth, all other groups that live in informal settlements in this process. Next. What we find is that we are very proud to be part of the creation of the Lla Principles. And much of these principles are based on the reality of what community networks require for serious locally led action for climate change to occur. And we can proudly say that we as STI and as national affiliates compel ourselves to fulfill these various processes at our levels. And we invite global, national, multilateral institutions to join us. And right now there are about 140 organizations that are members of this process. And we know that at the last COP in Glasgow that Norway also joined this process. Next. One of our very important and critical commitment is that on behalf of STI, I am one of the ambassadors for the Race to Resilience. What we hope to do in the Race to Resilience is to create a new normal in which one group of people say it's 800 million people, we say it's 2 billion people, regardless of the number of zeros. Community networks and their leadership have to sit at the decision-making table in order to be able to bring issues, concerns, and action at the local level, to interact with science, finance, and multilateral institutional engagements, which usually end up deciding all these things with our countries, but rarely involve the urban poor into this process. And therefore, for us, the area of local adaptation, of linking adaptation to the challenges that come out of large mitigation projects, to look at the challenges of loss and damage, all these things require the most vulnerable to bring both the issues of social justice and local adaptation to the table, regardless of what aspect of development or climate change is discussed. The reason we believe this is that every individual at the moment living in informal settlements makes survival strategies. In order to survive, what should I do? We need to convert this into situations where a support structure is provided to produce a resilience response. A resilience response for us is a choice that you make with some support of your neighborhood, of your city, of your nation, of the globe, to move to a space where the choice that you make doesn't keep you at a survival level, but allows mobility and evolution, asset creation, and an important improvement in the quality of your life. And the local adaptation route for us is the starting point of bringing our development and our climate concerns together. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? So in STI, in the last 2 years, because we couldn't meet each other and we couldn't have our exchanges, which we usually do, we started a web-based discussion. And out of that came very interesting points, 5 of which have become now our global campaigns. The first one, which is called Roof Over Our Heads, looks at the physical conditions of our homes and their vulnerability to climate, be it heat, be it rain, be it mudslides, be it typhoons and tsunamis. The point is, what can we learn from improving the safety of our structure? What can we demand from our governments? What can we ask our scientists and material developers people to make it accessible to do this? And how can we work with others to make this change happen, so that the choice of producing housing, which most of slum dwellers do by themselves incrementally over time, is transformed from a survival to a resilient manner. The second one is the whole importance of diet in people's lives. COVID produced so many chronic diseases and infectious diseases, a disease burden that people have never seen before, apart from their crisis of coping with COVID. And we believe that nutrition and importance of a healthy diet, good quality gut health is something that all of us should understand, know about, and have access to. The third one is the role of transport in our lives. The fact that most women are a good litmus test of whether the transport works for them, that the new sustainable transport is affordable for them, that they are not located in spaces where 2/3 of their wages go to cover transport to go to work or to send their children to school. And finally, to look at the overall health and safety standards in relationship to planning, in terms of development investment. And last but not least, that we do not want to be victims of the ongoing exponential increase in disasters that are affecting us, but we want to work with global institutions, not just for recovery from a tsunami or a fire or a mudslide, but to develop long-term resilient solutions, and that those people who come to help us in the recovery process do this to look at immediate to medium and long-term transformation. So these are our 5 campaigns that we have developed. We're looking at partnerships and engagement with different communities, networks, associations to look at what new priorities that are considered by others that we can use ourselves. Listening to Mark and reading a lot about the present report, we see that our concerns about dislocation of the challenges of mitigation investments that produce dislocation of communities and destroy informal habitat as a result are now things that we want to work on together. But most importantly, we believe that the presence of poor communities in a decision-making forum at the high level changes and transforms the way in which we bring knowledge to the table and become the litmus test of whether the adaptation and resilient-based solutions are fit for purpose, that they communicate the right things to large volumes of people, because adaptation, unlike mitigation, requires huge numbers of people to make different choices that are good for them and good for the planet. Next slide, please. We are looking for different types of interesting partnerships. One of the things that SDI does is called the Know Your City campaign, in which we identify all informal settlements, we digitalize them, and we look at what they tell us about what are the investment deficits. Last year, when the World Bank was looking at data on hotspots in the world, we collaborated with them in 8 cities to look at how poor people have infrastructure or don't have infrastructure to address the COVID crisis. And it was an amazing partnership, which we hope we can expand to say 100, 200 cities, where local granular data and global algorithm ranged kind of projects can link together to produce granular insights to poor communities on the choices that they have. Next. So this is just a quick thing about Know Your City. We have plans to expand, improve, and update the Know Your City process. And we're looking for alliances and partnerships that will allow every one of our cities to map informal settlements. Can you go to the next slide, please? And develop a very robust vulnerability index that not only talks about development deficits, but also looks at the climate vulnerabilities, whether to get together and what kind of solutions can cities do with us to reduce this vulnerability, and to be able to create measurements that show that from the benchmarking period to the rest, what happens. And we're looking for partnerships with cities, with our national governments, and in fact, also with global institutions. Next. So for us, the most important thing is to produce strong, sustained grassroots movements of the urban poor. We are now working very closely with other social movements, the Vairo Commission, the Global Waste Pickers Network, and we're looking at ways by which we can all work together to produce robust ideas for people living in vulnerable, informal settlements, both in the case of the Vairo Commission, also rural women, in order to create women-centered social movements that work on long-term goals as well as immediate situations. We are also looking for ways by which we participate in the design, execution, and assessment of solutions. And we hope that we can demonstrate that we are good partners that bring serious evidence from the ground that is transformatory. Next. There was one slide which didn't come through here, which is that in our work right now, we also see an urgent need for serious investment to be able to reach poor communities. Every single global instrument has deep problems and challenges in doing that. And when we do an analysis as a result of our contribution to the development of the Lla Principles, we actually find that giving money to the poor is considered risky, and therefore it produces reputational challenges for global donors. On the other hand, you find that there is very little money actually allocated for local adaptation and resilience building, and even that money is not utilized. But we see the STI federations, the local networks of grassroots groups, to be the canary in the canary in the mine. It tells you the challenges, the problems, the reasons for failures, so that you can produce robust global solutions that can be adapted for various localities. In the end, the principles remain the same. The practice of adaptation, like many of the earlier speakers said, has to be with large numbers of people making choices based on evidence, science, and a confirmation of traditional practices. And the last point I want to make before I close is that I come from Mumbai. Our young Deputy Chief Minister has put together the plan which was presented earlier. This is the plan for Mumbai, but there is a plan for the 42 cities of the Maharashtra state, which is actually larger than 2/3 of all European countries in population. And we are involved in all those things. And we look forward to, at another event, talking about the role and contributions that we are negotiating to play not only in that process, but to bring that to the race to resilience and encourage more subnational groups to participate in this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila Patel, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we have gone a little bit over the schedule, so we will skip the questions and answers session and move directly to our Director of the Department for Climate and Environment at Norad, Stig Tråvik, who is currently in Indonesia. Stig, the floor is yours for some concluding remarks, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you for this opportunity to address both this illustrious panel and also all of you listening. I'm very happy to see that so many people are with us. As Heidi said, I'm in Indonesia, a city in Jakarta, a city which illustrates very many of the issues that our panelists have been talking about. I'm not going to try to sum up because I think the debate has been much too rich for me to pretend that I would be able to, but I'll try to give a few comments. First of all, I would really like to commend Habitat Norway for taking this initiative. Habitat Norway is a very active organization in Norway in bringing attention to the importance of cities and of the importance of cities in climate. And I think the fact that you've been able to bring such a strong panel together today really shows the strength of the work you are doing. I would also like to commend our two IPCC researchers really on their contribution here today, but also on the way IPCC has been working. I think the idea of launching 3 separate part reports have been great. It keeps the attention for longer, and it gives the public a chance to really absorb both what is the problem, what is behind it, and how can we solve the problems. I think it's a great idea. Also, I would like to underline that I think IPCC is sort of at 3.0 1.0 now. What do I mean by that? I think 1.0 was to explain to the world that we have a real serious climate crisis. I think 2.0 was to bring nature into the equation and show that the problems of climate and nature are interconnected. And I think 3.0, which really happened with this year's reports, is to show that the social dimensions is part and parcel of the solutions. Only if you include the social dimensions of it, you'll be able to solve the crisis that we are facing. I really liked Professor Mark Pelling's idea of risk cascades. I think it really shows some of the how these issues can be interconnected. Here in Jakarta, they're facing all of that, and as the professor said, cities, you have all the problems, but you have also a lot of potential. So I think a city like Jakarta shows that. They've just opened a metro, which will contribute, of course, to better social transportation, but also to reduced air pollution. I would like to sort of pick up on Dr. Schweib's point about breaking down the different working methods of the sectors. And I think that is extremely important. That really what the last IPCC report shows is that you need to get all of these dimensions to work in conjunction in a way which brings increased, not reduced, social justice. I think pointing that out is extremely important. Then, of course, I think that IPCC 4.0 would be to show us the way how to make all of these transitions in a politically feasible way. So to give us the packages, the little work has done, although Oslo is not a big capital by global standards, the basic problems are the same. So I think there is something important there. I would also like to thank Sheila Patel for pointing to Mumbai, because I think it is also a city that has really done a lot. And I have met your wonderful Chief Minister Aditya Thackeray. I'm very, very, very impressed with what he and you and what Mumbai is doing, including on issues like plastic pollution and other issues around the livability of the city. Last, I would also like to thank the team here at Norad for making this happen. We would really like to be part of these sort of discussions of helping to bring together different perspectives and bring together the people who have the good solutions. And I would also like to note one particular issue also raised by Sheila Patel, and that is the issue of really getting better at working with local organizations. We have noted that also in other parts of our work, and we're really trying to think hard about how can we make our practices and our requirements fit better with the realities of those who work on the real local level. It's work in progress. I cannot promise that we will be much better tomorrow, but it's definitely high on our agenda. So again, thanks to all of you for being here today. I think this is a discussion to be continued. I think the rich discussion here today shows that it was optimistic to think that we could do it in a little over an hour, but let's keep this discussion going. Thank you for your attention.